Welcome to the Weekly Governance Voice. This is a show that will be coming every week, Friday, 7:30 to 8. This is a show brought to you courtesy of the Institute of Certified Secretaries and powered by Bafunde. I am your host, Obare Nyaega. This morning, we are lucky to host FCS Waweru Mathenge, who is the immediate former chair of the Institute and currently works at NCBA Group as the Group Company Secretary. So welcome, FCS Mathenge.
Thank you very much, CS Obare. It is a pleasure to be here on this show, being the first show in this series, and I'm looking forward to it.
Correct. So probably you'll begin off by telling us about the banking industry, where you've been for many years. And my first question would be, if you look at the whole framework in the banking sector and the structures of governance, how would you say it appears like in the country?
Thank you for that question. I think the place to start is to state first that the banking industry is a highly regulated industry. And it's clear to see why it needs to be highly regulated. What is banking business? Banking business involves, one, taking money on deposit or on current account from depositors who are the public. Now, that is a very important activity, because what you're saying is that you're taking money from the public for use in the business. Onward lending to people who need money for their various business activities. So you need to protect, number one, those depositors who have placed funds on deposit or in current account in those banks or institutions. And because of that, then the industry then tends to be very highly regulated to offer that protection. And in Kenya, the framework of that regulation takes the form of the Banking Act, primarily, but there are also elements of the Companies Act, because banks by nature are actually limited liability companies incorporated under the Companies Act. And then there's also the Central Bank of Kenya Act, which creates the regulator of the industry, which is the Central Bank of Kenya, and also governs its operations. So the central bank, as part of its mandate in regulating the industry, has been conferred certain powers under the Banking Act. And powers include carrying out inspections, requiring reporting, very detailed reporting on quarterly, sometimes also a monthly basis, on the operations of the banks. And then in addition to that, the central bank is empowered to issue what we call Prudential Guidelines. And these guide very specific areas of business. For instance, even just the setup of a bank. What are the requirements? If it is lending, what are the requirements in lending? It's something called risk classification. If a loan, you've given a loan and it's tending towards becoming bad, how then do you proceed with the classification of that? In addition, there are also prudential guidelines on corporate governance. A board, how many members of, or what size of board should a bank have? And they're prescribed there. What board committees should there be? And the prudential guidelines require at least 3 basic ones, which is your risk management committee, your audit committee, and a credit committee. Credit being the primary business of banks. And then there are others, consumer protection, and a whole host of others, prudential guidelines, which then govern how banks are supposed to operate. So it is a highly regulated industry for good reason, and all that is geared towards protecting depositors, and also, of course, enabling the banks to do what they're supposed to do, which is as intermediaries. They take money from what we call the savers, simply put, savers, and give it over to the users of money for various business activities. So simply put, that is it, yes.
So do you think, in your view, that the banking sector is overregulated?
I wouldn't say it is overregulated. I would first say regulation is good for this particular industry just because of the nature of the business. Regulation is good. But of course, there have been, in the past, and not necessarily in Kenya, but even in other countries like the US, for instance, you're familiar with the 2008 credit crunch, which was caused primarily by banks engaging in certain very risky activities, which then, when they collapsed, had a domino effect on the entire economy and the world as a whole. In Kenya, we've also had instances of banks engaging in very risky activities. And that's why if you look at the history of the Banking Act and how it has developed, it was meant primarily to address some of those weaknesses or activities which were deemed to be quite risky. So that's why you have now, statutorily, banks must maintain a certain level of capital. They must maintain certain core ratios of capital against, risk-weighted assets, capital, then liquidity ratios. How much money, liquid cash, should banks have in order to meet the day-to-day demands from the depositors who come to demand their money. Remember, banks must be able to pay money on demand. Now, they have lent it to customers who, sometimes for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So the money is out there. So it's not always in the bank cash, but because the demands of customers coming for cash you can pretty much be able to assess what it will be if the economy is operating correctly. The banks are required to maintain a certain level of liquidity or cash in the bank so that they meet those demands on demand as they come on a day-to-day basis. So those ratios are meant for a purpose, yes, so that the banks can continue performing their work of intermediation. You
mentioned a strong point about also locally. We've seen challenges of some of the banks.
Yes.
And actually, some of the things that have happened to our banks that have probably collapsed or gone through receivership, they seem to point towards some governance issues. Would you maybe let us know what learnings we could have from there for purpose of the growth of the banking sector?
Yes. So a lot of this has been reported in the media.
Yeah.
And I would classify the failures into two primary categories from what is in the public domain. One is a conflict of interest issue. Directors granting themselves loans and not intending to pay them. So there's a definite conflict there. But the other one is also poor risk management practices. And risk here is not just in credit risk, but sometimes also operational risk. So, failure to have appropriate security measures. And so you find maybe the banks are being stolen from left, right, center. But the primary one would be credit risk, poor lending practices, where you've lent a lot of money out there without having assessed the probability that you'll get repaid as and when the loan is required to be repaid. And you find that then if the loan is not repaid, security that was taken to secure that loan was not adequate. Yeah. So all that it points towards poor risk management practices. And those have led then to the collapse of a number of banks. From the I think it was the 1980s, there was a series of collapses, and just about 5 years ago, there was another series of collapses of two institutions, and that's what came out, in to the public domain, that there was those were the primary issues. Of course, it's it's not as simple as that. There, of course, other issues, but primarily, I would say those are the ones that caused the collapse. So, and these are, you'll see, are very critical pillars of governance. Conflict of interest, risk management. Those are very core pillars of good governance. That you avoid conflicts of interest, and that you also have a sound risk management practices. Yes. So overarching, therefore, you would say that there were poor governance practices. A lot of them also say, one could also say that maybe the composition of the board, or the boards themselves, were not effective. They didn't play their role to ensure that the organization was being properly run. So again, that tends to, or rather points to poor governance in the organization. So yeah.
If you look at, let's say, the economy,
yes,
the contribution, I know it can be very detailed, but if you look at an overview,
yes,
for somebody who wants to understand, what sort of contribution are we talking about of the banking sector to the economy in brief?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. People tend to focus mainly on the profitability of banks. But I think, and that's why the question is very good, what exactly do banks do? How do they contribute to the economy? Now, do you know that banks have over 5 trillion in assets, total assets? And this includes loans and advances, government securities. If you look at their balance sheet, total is over 5 trillion. Now, our economy, GDP, is about, what, 10 trillion? Yeah. So already you can see what the banking sector is contributing to that to the economy. Now, these assets are split into mainly loans and advances, which is probably 55% of the 5 trillion, over 5 trillion. And then you have also, of course, investments in government securities, which you can say is lending to the government. That is lending to the government. And the government needs money for its activities, which include building your roads, providing healthcare, education. The government borrows to meet those needs. So if you say that 45% of the 5 trillion is with government, already the contribution is looking very sizable. Yes. But in addition to that, banks also provide employment. There are over 30,000 employees in banks in Kenya. And of course, these employees provide, they support families out there. And they also help support the economy in that way. Banks also, as an industry, are large taxpayers. Yeah. In fact, I think they're probably the largest taxpayers if looked at as an industry. Yeah? The statistics are, I'm sure, pretty. One can get them from the national statistics records. But I think suffice it to say that banks do contribute a huge percentage of the tax that's collected by government. So they play their part also in that respect. But I think, it's important also to drill down. When we say assets, it's a very top line sort of term. But what does that mean? It means that there are a lot of businesses across the economy which have accessed funding from the banks. Yeah. So if the banks have lent almost 3 trillion out there to normal businesses, Kenyans out there doing their own enterprise, that is a lot of contribution to the economy. Yeah. And it's across all sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, transport, all sectors of the economy will normally or will actually come to banks primarily for their funding. So the knock-on effect, of course, is that if those businesses do well, of course, they enlarge the tax-based tax collections, and they also build their own sectors of the economy. So that can be seen to sort of come from the banking sector, the support given by the banking sector. So banks play a very critical role.
So my question then goes this way. You support a lot of businesses or individuals.
Yes.
And I'm keen on what kind of support you give them to ensure that they also have structures, you know, that will make them sustainable, because that's the whole point.
Yes.
You give them like some structural support.
Well, one thing we don't do, we don't run people's businesses for them. I think it's important to be clear.
Okay.
Banks will not run your business for you. You are the entrepreneur, you're the business person, the business owner. You run your business. You know how best to run your business. Banks can offer advice on how to run your business. So for instance, if they see you have a governance challenge, they could advise you, you may need to look at your governance structure, set up a board of directors, have proper succession plans, which will ensure the continuity of the organization. They may also advise you that you're over-leveraged, you're taking on too much debt, and the business will not be able to sustain it. So you need to inject your own capital into the business, so that it then is able to be sustainable. So banks will offer advice, but they do not run your business for you.
That's critical. That's critical. Yes. And let me just find out also in terms of, you know, when people are going through this pandemic, we are seeing banks making profits. So people feel, you know, is there some fair play? Is there a problem? And is there some strategic things you've done so that it's not perceived like you're not maybe supporting the economy as much? What's happening?
No, okay. I think, it's one of those points which one can debate for a long time, and as people have certain fixed mindsets about this. But in essence, remember, banks are businesses as well. So if they do make a profit, that's really what the shareholders of the banks expect. They're not charities. They're businesses into which people have invested their own money, you know, the shareholders. So they expect a return.
Okay.
So I think it is fair to say that banks should be profitable. Now, does it mean that when others are suffering, other players in an economy are suffering, banks should also suffer? Actually, they do. You will have seen a lot of banks released their results for 2020. Yeah? You've seen the trend was that in 2020, because of the pandemic, the performance was quite poor, or rather compared to previous year, it dipped. So banks also took a hit. And it was expected because you know, their customers were being unable to repay. So of course, certain provisions had to be made for loans which could not be repaid. So it was a hard time for everybody, yeah. But I think banks also did their part to support customers and the general economy. So, for instance, restructuring of loans, yeah. You know, if you look at the loan book that was structured, is almost like 30% of the total loan book was restructured to support customers who were going through a hard time, and that restructuring took the several forms. It could be lengthening the term, so reducing the repayments on a monthly basis. Some customers got moratoria, 3 months, 6 months, don't pay anything, yeah, or just service interest alone, yeah, to ease the burden, yeah, of the cash crunch that people were facing. So I think one also needs to look at the other side of the role that banks play, rather than just the issue that they make profit. Yeah, you know, they're expected to make profit, otherwise they would not be in existence. Yes, they do not exist. Okay. Yeah.
Fair enough. I think it's a perception in the market actually that then banks seem to make profits even when people are downward, not very much. But pretty much. So the question would be, then I'd probably move from the banking sector to your personal journey, which becomes critical. You've been in the journey of governance for a number of years, and you have experiences and learnings. Maybe you want to share a number of things on how you manage that kind of a life, having worked for multinationals over a period of time, to where you are today. I think that would be critical for us as well to learn. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's an interesting question. I think my journey has been, I wouldn't say a straight line, but I think the experiences that I have gone through have now brought me to the stage that I am. But I think I would say there's certain things that one needs to really focus on if one wants to really grow a career in this area of governance. Number one, I think it's important that you have to have certain standards you live by, ethical standards. Remember, in any business, if you're not honest, if you're not a person who their yes there is yes, their no is no, they don't have standards, you're not going to last in business very long. So it's good to have those standards and build a reputation as a person of high ethical standards, and somebody who also appreciates sound business, appreciaes and actually practices sound business techniques and criteria. But in addition to that, there's the of course hard work. This profession is not the easiest. I think the demands on one's time are very, very great, but one must sort of find a way to balance that. But you can't substitute hard work, for anything else. So you need to be a hard worker. You need to have attention to detail. You need also to continuously learn. The area of governance is developing and is growing, and because of the dynamics of the environment, the business or the economic environment, you find that things change quite fast. And you must be able to understand those changes and be able to adapt the organization to them, or provide the sound advice that would enable the organization to adapt to those changes. So it's important then to ensure continuous learning. And I think people may complain that, why do we have to keep doing continuous professional development? It's because of that. What you know today may be totally irrelevant next year. Yes, so you need to know what's happening so that you know what's going to be relevant for you to know next year. Continuously enhance your capacity, and then it's good to have a good network of professional colleagues who you can call upon and who you can debate ideas, and it helps clarify one's thinking in particular subject areas. So it's important to have that kind of support system, if I may call it that. Right. In as much as your professional colleagues, also your competitors, they are also a good support for one's growth in the profession. Okay. Yeah. So those I think are critical factors. Of course, there are others. Okay. Targeted, where you want to work, you need to know where you want to work. I personally started off as a lawyer in practice, but I did a lot of corporate law in practice, and then I went in-house, initially in the legal function, but doubling also as a company secretary. But now I have reached the company secretary, but I also head the legal department. So you can see my background sort of has brought me to where. That's why I said it's what has brought me to where I am. Okay. Yes.
Maybe finally, we call you chairman.
Yes.
You could face your camera and talk to the younger people. Aspiring people want to become group company secretaries, want to grow in the corporate professionals, and just give them some bit of words of wisdom. We have very many young members who want to learn, and maybe you could inspire them in about 2 minutes as we went down.
Okay.
Chairman.
Yeah. So thank you. So to the young members or aspiring members of the profession, I think this is an honorable profession, the profession of certified secretary. I certainly do not regret getting into it. I think it has been very fulfilling, and I would encourage those who have been considering it to actually take it up seriously. As I said, my journey has involved a lot of hard work, a lot of time commitment, a lot of expanding my capacity to be able to enhance my professional skills. And that is a continuous process. So I'm continuously learning, and that is something that will actually feature for you should you choose this career. You have to continuously learn. But in addition to that, ensure that you build your contacts, get to know people in the industry, understand your business very, very well. If you find yourself in a particular organization, do not limit yourself to just your specific function. Rather, get to know what happens at every level of that organization. That way, as the company secretary, one thing you have to be, a company secretary is said to be the conscience of the board, but not just that. It becomes also a trusted advisor, and you cannot be a trusted advisor if you do not know what goes on in the organization. So you must be able to understand what goes on in the organization. Know everybody in the organization, what they do, how their work actually then adds up when combined with others to what the organization's objectives are. And that way you are able then to provide that value to that organization. It goes without saying that as secretary to the board, you must also value the issue of confidentiality. So there are matters that you will come across your desk or that you will be present when they're being discussed. You must be a person who can be trusted to keep matters confidential. And that's part of, I think, one's standards, or the standards that one sets for himself or herself. So you must be a person who can be trusted to keep information confidential. And it becomes even more important if you're in a listed entity. You cannot go announcing before the board has actually published information, how the performance of the company is, among other things. So there's a great responsibility that is placed on company secretaries when it comes to information. You're really the guardian of that information. So in brief, hard work, high personal standards, then being able to enhance one's capacity on a continuous basis, and also knowing, understanding your business very, very well. Those, I think, would be the things that I have found very valuable in the growth of my career, and I would commend the same to you who is aspiring into this profession. And I wish you the very best. I can assure you it's not a journey that you will regret. You'll actually enjoy it. And I always say, enjoy what you're doing. Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. Enjoy what you're doing, and you become a better professional for it.
Right. Thank you. That was FCS Waweru Mathenge, immediate former chair of the institute and currently the group company secretary, NCBA Group. That was a pleasure, and we want to see you again next week in our weekly Governance Voice, brought to you courtesy of ICS and powered by Bafunde. I'm your host, Obare. Until next week, thank you and God bless you. Nice weekend ahead.